Amidst the peaceful and idyllic beach scene, a clear, childlike voice full of excitement echoed from afar, seemingly urging friends to hide very carefully. Next, another voice began to count down, the numbers resounding steadily, from 100, then 99, 98, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. It turned out the children were playing hide and seek. A mischievous boy, silently thinking about his secret hiding spot, believed his friends would never be able to find his hiding place. As the sunset began to descend, dyeing the entire beach golden, a voice called out, gently reminding everyone that it was getting dark and it was time for everyone to go home. Another voice quickly agreed in response. 4 children gathered on the beach as the sun gradually disappeared. One boy in the group began to count, his voice clear and somewhat formal, from 1, then 2, then 3. Suddenly a boy asked, his tone mixed with a little anxiety and confusion, searching for Alex's whereabouts. The other boy replied, his voice somewhat sad and disappointed, that he hadn't seen him anywhere. Night had fallen, enveloping the silent harbor near the towering lighthouse. Flashlight beams swept everywhere, accompanied by calls for Alex. The man shone his flashlight beam onto the ground, and then a horrifying sight appeared before his eyes. A boy lay motionless on the cold, rocky shore, his entire body covered in bizarre oysters clinging tightly to his flesh. He let out a blood-curdling scream, utterly desperate. Upon realizing it was Alex, Alex's father collapsed, kneeling beside his son's cold body. His face was stunned, eyes lifeless, his mouth ceaselessly calling his son's name in extreme, indescribable pain. Another man approached, his trembling hand gently placing itself on the shoulder of the father writhing in agony. Another man standing nearby spoke, his voice full of helplessness and bitterness, announcing that they couldn't lift the boy anymore. His body was firmly stuck to the oysters. That man, apparently an acquaintance named John, after some thought, decided there was only one way: to use a shovel to dig Alex out from the rocks and oysters. A dry, cold crack echoed in the silent space as the metal shovel blade struck the hard rocks, signaling a difficult and painful task. Finally, when Alex was freed from the oysters, the boy was already dead. The father's mournful cries echoed sorrowfully, mingling with the eerie sound of the sea waves. Alex's father sat with his head bowed beside his son's coffin, extreme pain evident in every line on his weathered face. Alex lay still inside, his body still covered by the bizarre oysters. The clicking sounds continued, steady and haunting, interspersed with the father's sobs and desperate calls for his son. The father clutched his face, wailing loudly, the heart-wrenching cry of an old man mourning his young son. Suddenly, amidst the suffocating silence, Alex's father was startled with astonishment. Alex, lying in the coffin, unexpectedly snapped his eyes open. His eyes were bloodshot, empty and lifeless, staring straight ahead, devoid of expression. Alex slowly sat up in the coffin, a slow and rigid movement. A hoarse, deep growl emanated from the boy's mouth, a sound not human. His father was utterly terrified, fear completely overwhelming his mind. Suddenly, Alex let out a terrifying roar, scaring his father half to death. He continued to scream, his shrill cries seeming to tear through the silent night, signaling that something terrible beyond imagination had occurred. Outside, near the towering lighthouse, someone heard those desperate cries for help. In another nearby house, John was looking into the microwave when he was startled by the shrill screams echoing from outside. He wondered what serious matter was unfolding. John's wife quickly came out from an inner room. She listened intently for a moment, then spoke, her voice tinged with worry, saying she thought she heard someone crying for help. John's wife tried to listen more carefully and recognized the familiar voice. She told her husband it sounded like Alex's father and urged him to go out quickly to see what had happened. Alex's father, frantic, pointed towards his house, his trembling voice urging everyone to go inside and see. Curious villagers gathered around, one after another asking what serious thing had happened to frighten him so. Alex's father pointed towards the room where the coffin was placed, his voice still trembling with fear, stammering that it was right in there, for everyone to see for themselves. He dared not look again. Curious, everyone crowded around, peering into the coffin. Instantly, the faces of all present turned pale with horror, mouths agape, speechless, wondering what on earth was happening. Someone in the crowd of villagers, after a moment of stunned silence, let out a blood-curdling scream, his voice full of terror and disbelief, announcing that the body had disappeared. Alex's father was utterly panicked. He couldn't believe his eyes, constantly stammering how it could be. It was clearly lying there just moments ago. Amidst the chaotic and tense atmosphere, someone in the crowd suddenly cried out loudly, calling everyone to come and see what was happening. On the wooden floor, wet footprints of a strange shape appeared clearly, leading from the coffin outwards. The first person to spot them spoke, his voice slightly trembling, saying they looked like Alex's footprints. Alex's father cried out in despair, his voice full of self-blame and anguish, wondering what terrible misfortune he had brought upon them. Someone standing beside him tried to console him, saying that at this point crying wouldn't solve anything. It was best for everyone to quickly follow the footprints to find Alex. Another person in the crowd suggested he would quickly go report to the village chief to mobilize more people for the search. It was late at night. On the deserted beach near the lighthouse, a silent, cold atmosphere enveloped the entire area. Two men walked along the beach, the faint light from one's flashlight sweeping across the dense darkness, creating bizarre shapes. One of them asked his companion Leo, his voice somewhat hesitant and full of concern, if he also felt the situation was truly strange and incomprehensible. The other replied, his tone skeptical and uncertain. Perhaps some ghostly apparition had indeed occurred. Leo appeared indifferent, saying who knew, they should find Alex's whereabouts first and talk later. Suddenly, another young man appeared from the darkness, his face showing clear surprise. He asked, then stated firmly, that both of them had just been at Alex's house and Brother Wang was definitely not there. John's wife heard these words and exclaimed in astonishment. She couldn't believe what she had just heard, stammering how it could be. Her husband had clearly been out for a long time. Abruptly, a blood-curdling scream full of terror echoed from the distance in the darkness. Someone shrieked that they had seen a ghost. The man who had just spoken to Leo and his friend, along with John's wife, were all startled with fright upon hearing the scream. All three hurriedly ran towards the source of the scream. John's wife, her heart filled with fear and unease, silently wondered if something bad had happened to her husband. Someone in the group urged everyone to hurry. John trembled all over, his voice stammering incoherently. He managed to utter, word by word, that he had seen a ghost,
Pond 5.
A real ghost. John fearfully backed away step by step, unconsciously muttering curses. Right in front of him, sprawled on the ground, was a man's head, also entirely covered in gruesome oysters, eyes bulging with terror. Leo suddenly pointed towards another direction in the darkness, his voice somewhat urgent, calling out his friend's name loudly, telling him to look over there immediately. Leo followed his friend's pointing finger, then spoke, his voice somewhat uncertain, that something seemed to be buried in the ground there. The flashlight beam from one man shone directly onto the ground, and there it was, Alex's body, lying motionless again. His entire body still covered in the gruesome, tightly clinging oysters. Everyone exclaimed in horror that it was Alex. Impossible. Why had his body returned here? The three men stood stunned, looking at the horrifying scene before them, no one able to speak. One of them spoke, his voice full of fear and bewilderment, saying it wasn't just Alex, but John too had. The one holding the flashlight was utterly terrified, wondering, "Oh my God, could this really be some terrible curse?" While everyone was still in shock, someone in the group spoke up, announcing that the village chief and others from the village had arrived. The village chief appeared, his face showing clear seriousness and worry. He asked, his voice deep and authoritative, what was happening here. John's wife ran over from somewhere, her face pale with fear, her voice lost in panic, desperately calling her husband's name. Leo was surprised to see John's wife appear. He asked why she was here at this time. John's wife seemed to ignore Leo's words, continuing to call her husband's name in pain and despair. John's wife knelt beside her husband's body, her trembling hands shaking him, her voice choked as she asked him what was wrong, why it had come to this. She continued to shake her husband desperately, her tearful voice pleading with him to wake up, to come to, asking him what had happened to him. Leo tried to intervene, saying this looked strange and terrifying. But John's wife seemed to hear nothing anymore. She let out a blood-curdling scream, tears streaming down her face, desperately asserting that she didn't care about anything anymore. She could only use her hands to dig at her husband's body, weeping tragically, the immense pain of loss overwhelming her mind and body. But her husband's body was now firmly stuck to the rocks and covered in sharp oysters. Despite trying everything, she didn't know how to remove these oysters from her husband's corpse. She bowed her head again, clutching her husband's body tightly, her voice choked with sobs. Suddenly, a horrifying event occurred. John, who was presumed dead and entirely covered in oysters, abruptly snapped his eyes open. His eyes were bloodshot, sharp fangs appeared, and he let out a terrifying, inhuman roar. John's wife was utterly terrified. She let out a blood-curdling scream, unable to believe what was happening right before her eyes. It was a nightmare. Another blood-curdling scream tore through the silent night. John, now transformed into a gruesome and terrifying living corpse, bit deeply into his wife's neck. Fresh blood gushed out, staining the entire area red. The village chief and Leo, standing nearby, were utterly terrified. They screamed. The other two men in the group stood stunned, their bodies rigid with fear, completely shocked by what had just happened. Alex's body still lay motionless there. Suddenly, the boy's eyes slowly opened, a terrifying, lifeless, bloodshot red. Someone standing nearby whispered, his voice trembling, "Its eyes are open." Alex's father, still reeling from the deaths of John and his wife, was utterly terrified upon seeing this. He called his son's name, his voice full of despair and disbelief. Alex slowly rose from the ground, his entire body still covered in the gruesome oysters. He too had awakened, but it was not a return to life, but the rising of something far more horrifying and terrifying. Alex's body lay sprawled on the cold rocks, his eyes still wide open, a terrifying, lifeless, bloodshot red. Alex's father and another man stood there, both speechless before the horrifying scene. The man tried to shake Alex's father vigorously, urging him to snap out of it, not to look anymore. But Alex's father seemed to have lost all reason, his mouth ceaselessly muttering his son's name. Alex stood straight up, his entire body still covered by the thick layer of oysters. Horrifying creaking and scraping sounds emanated from his body with every movement, sounds that made listeners shudder. Alex's father stared at his son, his own eyes gradually becoming empty, lifeless, devoid of vitality. A bizarre, incomprehensible, and haunting smile slowly spread across his lips as he called Alex's name. The man standing beside Alex's father tried to hold him back, screaming desperately for him not to do it, not to go near it. But Alex's father seemed to hear nothing anymore. He had lost all reason and lunged straight towards his son. Alex's father embraced Alex, who had now transformed into a terrifying living corpse. His mouth still held that strange, haunting smile, his voice pathologically affectionate as he said, "Alex, father is here with you." The remaining man stood there, witnessing the entire horrifying scene, screaming in terror, trying to warn that it was very dangerous not to go near it. The reanimated Alex hugged his father tightly. The creaking, scraping sounds from its body grew louder, clearer, like bones grinding against each other, utterly horrifying. Alex, or rather the monster in Alex's guise, bit deeply into his father's neck. Fresh blood gushed out, drenching him. The boy's father gasped his last words, his voice weak and resigned. "This is retribution, the consequence I must bear." The sole survivor, witnessing the entire horrifying tragedy, collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with fear, desperately crying out that this was indeed retribution, a terrible punishment. Suddenly, while the man was still lost in despair, another hand, also covered in gruesome oysters, unexpectedly shot up from beneath the ground. Then followed the man's final, agonizing and desperate screams echoing in the silent night. About 6 months earlier, at a bustling pier, a group of fishermen was hurriedly unloading heavy crates. The rhythmic clatter of wooden crates hitting each other created an atmosphere of urgent labor. Suddenly, the village chief appeared from the steps leading down to the pier. His face was stern, his voice booming with authority, asking them what they thought they were doing. Didn't they know it was the closed fishing season? Yet they dared to act recklessly. Someone in the group of fishermen recognized him as their village chief. The village chief sternly warned, his voice threatening, that if they were caught by the authorities, they would all be fined so heavily they would lose everything. Didn't these scoundrels know fear? A man in the group of fishermen, none other than John, approached the village chief, familiarly draping an arm over his shoulder, then spoke softly, his voice full of flattery. "Village chief, it's almost New Year. Who would be free to inspect at this time anyway?" John deftly and skillfully slipped a rather thick wad of money into the village chief's hand, still speaking, his voice pleading that everyone in the village just wanted to earn a little extra for a better new year for their families, hoping the village chief would consider and accommodate them. The village chief looked at the money in his hand, then silently accepted it without a word. After taking the money, the village chief smiled cunningly and meaningfully, then advised them to work discreetly and not let it be known. If they were unlucky enough to get caught, he wouldn't be able to help. John happily replied, his voice full of gratitude and respect. A large fishing boat carrying hopes of a full catch, but also harboring unforeseeable seeds of disaster, proudly left the pier, heading straight out to the distant sea. John stood on the deck, his face showing clear confidence and a hint of greed. He boomed to everyone on board that this time they would use a desolation net, a type of net with extremely small mesh, designed so that not even the smallest fish could escape. John continued to urge everyone on the boat to work quickly and urgently, because if they weren't fast, there would be nothing left to catch. Opportunity waits for no one. The vast, expansive, and tranquil sea stretched out before them, concealing beneath it countless marine creatures and immeasurable dangers. In a corner of the deck, John's wife looked at her husband with a worried and uneasy expression. She hesitated, wanting to say something, but dared not speak. When the heavy net was pulled up from the water, inside was not fish, but a giant sea turtle. The turtle's entire body was covered in oysters, clinging tightly to its shell and flesh. John's wife exclaimed in astonishment, unable to believe her eyes, asking what on earth this thing was. John, without a word, kicked the poor sea turtle hard. John said angrily, his tone full of annoyance and displeasure, that it was truly bad luck to catch this damn thing at the beginning of the year. It ruined everything. John, without hesitation, immediately pulled out a sharp, gleaming knife from his toolbox. The sound of metal scraping against metal as he drew the knife made a cold, frightening swish. John's wife saw this and hurriedly ran to stop her husband, saying this old turtle looked very sacred. Perhaps it was a sea god. Maybe they should release it, lest some retribution occur, which would be terrible. John roughly pushed his wife's hand away, then raised the knife high in the air, his eyes showing clear anger and ferocity. He shouted, his voice full of contempt, "Retribution for what? If it keeps loitering here, all the fish and shrimp will be scared away. What will be left to catch then? To release or not to release?" John raised the sharp knife high, a cruel glint in his eyes, preparing to plunge the knife straight into the helpless sea turtle. The sharp, cold blade came down heavily. The sea turtle was killed unjustly and painfully. One of its eyes remained wide open, a bizarre blood red, as if containing a curse of resentment, an unresolvable hatred. The sunlight shone down, but the atmosphere still carried a heavy, gloomy air. The beach was now desolate and ruined. Blood was splattered everywhere, stained with sorrow and death. Nearby, the lighthouse still stood tall, silent and solitary, like a mute witness to all the tragedies that had occurred. A hand, also covered in gruesome oysters, slowly rose from the ground amidst the rocks on the beach, a slow and horrifying movement. Alex's head, now completely transformed into a terrifying living corpse, entirely covered by a thick layer of oysters, lay motionless among the cold rocks. A small sea turtle, perhaps one of the offspring of the large sea turtle that had been brutally murdered, slowly crawled beside Alex's head. The tiny clicking sound of its young shell against the rocks echoed in the silent space. Many other small sea turtles also crawled over one by one. They gathered, surrounding the oyster, covered corpses lying scattered and motionless on the rocks. The scene widened, revealing an incredibly bizarre and terrifying sight. Countless small sea turtles, hundreds, thousands, slowly advancing towards the beach from the deep water, like a silent army of vengeance.